January 12, 1945. Camp Hearn, Texas. A U.S. Signal Corps photographer, Private William Hartman, clicked the shutter just as the steam rose from a tray of fresh bread in the morning cold. In the frame, a line of exhausted German POW women stand ankle-deep in mud, wrapped in coarse blankets, their eyes hollow from weeks of starvation and fear. But who were these women? Where had they come from? And why did an American guard carry warm food toward them with a gentleness that made them hesitate instead of flinch? In the next hour they would be led somewhere none of them expected, not to punishment, not to interrogation, but to a place that would shatter everything they believed about their enemy. The photograph captures the moment before it happened. The question is, what happened after the shutter clicked? June 18, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell hit them before anything else. Warm biscuits, butter melting into soft dough, peppery white gravy thick enough to cling to a spoon. It drifted out of the wooden mess hall in slow waves, carried by the Texas heat and the faint breeze that swept across the barbed wire fences. The women stopped walking. All 43 of them, thin, hollow-eyed uniforms hanging on their bones like wet laundry, froze as if a single invisible hand had gripped their throats. They had whispered it to one another that morning on the truck. "We are starving. Anything will do." But none of them had imagined this. Not the smell, not the warmth, not the shocking familiarity of real food. Not in America, not in a prison camp, not from the enemy. Ingrid Weber, 22 years old and weighing barely 90 pounds, felt her knees weaken. For a moment, she couldn't tell if the dizziness came from hunger or disbelief. She clutched the side of the truck as the others behind her murmured in hesitant German. "Is that bread? No, something sweeter. It cannot be for us." 9. Impossible. The guards didn't shout, didn't force them forward. They simply waited, rifles slung casually over their shoulders as if 43 starving women staring at a mess hall were an everyday sight. Ingrid's stomach twisted so sharply she winced. She had not eaten anything warm in nearly 6 weeks. Their journey from France to the Atlantic port, then across the ocean on a Liberty ship, had been one long procession of watery soup, crusts of bread, and days where nothing came at all. By the time they reached Texas, her body no longer recognized the word full. Hunger had become a constant, like her own pulse. But this smell, this rich, impossible smell, awakened something she had forgotten she possessed: longing. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. They were prisoners of war. And yet, the Americans were cooking a breakfast that would have been a luxury in a German officer's home. The sun climbed higher, casting long golden streaks across the dirt yard. Ingrid blinked hard to clear her vision. Her eyes were dry. She had cried too much during the crossing, and now they burned from exhaustion. But she was wide awake. Every nerve in her body felt as though it had been shocked. Biscuits. Real biscuits. Her mother had only made them twice in her childhood. Flour was too precious, butter almost mythical. But she remembered the smell. And this was stronger, fuller, richer. A guard motioned gently. "This way, ladies." His tone was calm, almost polite. Another shock. The women exchanged uneasy glances. Politeness was a trap. They all knew that. Every German briefing they had sat through had hammered the same message. Americans torture prisoners. Americans starve captives. Americans humiliate women. Americans lack discipline and survive only on machines, not strength. But looking around, none of those warnings fit what she saw. No shouted insults, no dogs, no chains, no kicks, no guards glaring with hatred. Instead, A young American cook in a sweat-stained apron walked out of the mess hall carrying a metal tray. Steam rolled upward, and the smell punched the air again. Thicker now, close enough to touch. He called something to another cook and laughed. The sound sent a chill through Ingrid's chest. How could the enemy laugh like that with prisoners watching? How could they be relaxed, unworried, unafraid? In Germany, even civilians whispered. Food shortages had broken public spirit years ago. Ration cards were thinner each month. Mothers hid potatoes like treasure. The winter of 1944 had turned the cities into graveyards of hunger. What did America know of starvation? Apparently nothing. Ingrid stared at the mess hall's wooden steps. The boards looked hand-cut, dusty, used, ordinary, and yet the entire building radiated abundance, something as foreign to her as the Texas sun. Behind her, one of the older women, Gerda, murmured under her breath, "This country, it smells of food." It was not meant to be poetic. It was simply true. Ingrid swallowed hard. Shame warred with hunger in her stomach. The shame was sharper. Why should the enemy feed them? Why do this when German women and children were surviving on cabbage water? When German soldiers were eating black bread that crumbled like chalk? When her own brother had starved to death in Russia? Why biscuits? Why gravy? Why them? Nothing in her world offered an answer. As they stepped closer to the building, the heat from the stoves reached them. Gentle at first, then wrapping around their bodies like a blanket. Ingrid felt her fingers twitch. Her hands had forgotten what warmth meant. A thought flickered across her mind, quick and painful. Are they fattening us? Another woman whispered the same fear aloud. A tremor rippled through the group. Even those who had tried to be brave on the journey now looked around with the wide, frightened eyes of cornered animals. The guard nearest them noticed. He didn't shout or argue. He simply said, in slow German, "Not poison. Breakfast." The absurdity of it nearly broke Ingrid. Breakfast? For prisoners? Her ribs ached with the effort of breathing. Behind them, the truck driver stood with arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. He was tall, tanned, built like every propaganda poster had insisted Americans were not. Another contradiction. Everything was a contradiction. Back home, the Reich was collapsing. Not that officials admitted it openly, but Ingrid had seen it. Bombed cities, empty shelves, endless funerals, dragged-out ration lines. By 1944, Germany was a starving nation still pretending it was invincible. Here in Texas, she smelled flour, butter, pepper, sausage fat. She smelled a nation where food wasn't a privilege but an expectation. A place so abundant it fed its enemies better than her own country fed its citizens. GDP figures meant nothing to her, but the reality was unmistakable. This country was winning the war before a single biscuit reached her hands. And she knew it. The smell alone told her. She reached the doorway. The cook looked up. His hair stuck to his forehead and his cheeks were flushed from the heat of the ovens. When he saw her trembling, he paused, not in suspicion, but in concern. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked softly. "Ma'am." He called a German prisoner of war, ma'am. Ingrid's chest tightened. Her throat stung. A strange pressure rose behind her eyes. She stared at him, unable to answer. He turned, grabbed a ladle, and poured a heavy stream of white gravy over a fresh biscuit. It pooled at the edges, thick and glistening. Then he placed the plate in front of her. "For you." For a moment, the world fell silent. The other women watched through the doorway, skeptical, trembling, breathless. The guard shifted his weight. Outside, cicadas hummed. Somewhere far in the distance, a train whistle cut across the flat Texas plain. But inside Ingrid, there was only one question, loud and impossible. Why would an enemy feed me like this? She lifted the plate with both hands. It was warm, so warm it almost hurt. Behind her, someone whispered, "Americans treat prisoners this way?" The question hung in the air like a ghost, and with it came a second question, heavier, sharper, one that every viewer in 2025 would feel in their chest the moment the scene opened. What kind of country feeds its enemies like honored guests? Ingrid didn't know it yet. None of the women did. But this was the moment their world began to crack. This was the moment the lies unraveled. This was the moment America showed its power without firing a single shot. And it started with a biscuit drenched in gravy. For a long moment after receiving the biscuit and gravy, the women didn't move. They stood at the threshold of the mess hall like ghosts afraid to step into the world of the living. Hunger pulled them forward, but something older, something drilled into them through years of propaganda, held them back. Fear, and not the ordinary kind. This was the deep, crawling fear of those who had been told the same stories so many times they became truth. Ingrid could still hear the voices of their instructors in France, the warning spoken with solemn authority, the posters plastered on barracks walls. Americans torture prisoners. Women, POWs, will be humiliated. They starve captives to break them. Cowboys are violent savages, half-wild men who kill for sport. They had been told Americans were crude, undisciplined, racially mixed, intellectually inferior. A nation of loud, chaotic, uncontrolled people who relied on machines because they lacked the physical strength and character of Germans. It didn't matter that the war had already proven those ideas wrong. Propaganda wasn't meant to be believed. It was meant to be felt. And fear lingers long after facts arrive. Even now, standing in the warm light of the mess hall, holding a plate of food, Ingrid felt her shoulders tense. She expected something, an insult, a trap, a sudden shift in the guards' expressions revealing their true nature. Instead, a cook wiped his hands on his apron and said, "Next, please. Don't be shy." The words were gentle, too gentle. Behind her, one of the younger women tugged at her sleeve. "Is this real?" she whispered. Ingrid didn't know. She didn't know anything anymore. They entered the mess hall slowly, like people stepping into a church after years away. The wooden floorboards creaked softly under their boots. The long rows of tables, sturdy, straight, built without pretension, looked strangely inviting. But the kitchen was what stunned them most. It was clean, impossibly clean. The metal counters gleamed. The stovetops were neatly scrubbed. Pans hung in perfect lines. The smell of flour and butter floated in the air like a soft blanket. This wasn't the kitchen of barbarians. This was the kitchen of a country that fed people confidently, almost casually, because food was something it could spare, a place where abundance was normal. Ingrid had read once that America was a land of plenty, but in Germany, plenty had become a legend, not a reality. Her country had been rationing food since 1939, first quietly, then desperately. When the Allied bombings destroyed factories, rail lines, and ports, shortages became starvation. By 1944, most German civilians lived on 800 to 1,000 calories a day. Turnips, ersatz bread, thin soups, powdered coffee substitutes. Now, here she stood watching Americans scoop thick gravy over biscuits as if it were nothing. A voice inside her whispered, "This is the real difference between nations." But another voice, louder, harsher, whispered, What if this is the last kindness before punishment? Fear tightened in her ribs. The guards didn't help, not because they were cruel, but because they were not cruel. And that terrified the women even more. American guards walked, casually, speaking to each other in low, relaxed voices. No shouting, no barking of orders, no slaps or shoves. They wore uniforms that looked comfortable, broken in by months of labor and sun. Their body language was open, unthreatening. When one of the POW women dropped her fork from trembling hands, a guard stooped to pick it up and said, "It's all right, you're safe." Safe. The word sounded foreign in German ears. Safety had vanished from Europe years ago, lost under rubble, ration lines, and blackouts. Gerda leaned toward Ingrid, whispering, "They're trying to lower our guard. That's what this is." But even she didn't sound convinced. The truth was unsettling. Nothing the Americans were doing matched the Reich's warnings. If anything, the guards acted more like weary farm boys than vengeful conquerors. Their accents carried the softness of fields, not the harshness of ideology. And that alone contradicted everything the women had been taught to fear. When the meal finally began, the women sat rigid, eating slowly, cautiously, waiting for a test they believed must come. Every clatter of a cup made them flinch. Every footstep behind them drew their shoulders up in tension. But nothing happened. The guards chatted about baseball. A cook hummed something that sounded like a folk song. The afternoon sun streamed through the screened windows, lighting dust in the air like falling snow. Slowly, painfully, the women felt their fear clash with the reality around them. Why aren't they hurting us? Why aren't they mocking us? Why aren't they punishing us? Why are they treating us like people? The cruelest part of fear is that it doesn't fade quickly. It unravels thread by thread, and often it clings harder when confronted with unexpected kindness. As the women ate, their minds darted back to the realities of Europe. Ruins smoldering, trains halted, rail yards cratered, warehouses empty. They remembered the propaganda films they had watched, Americans portrayed as monstrous giants with crooked grins and violent habits. They remembered the warnings from officers. Better to die than be captured. Americans show mercy only to break your resolve. You are a woman. Capture means disgrace. And yet here they were, sitting at wooden tables eating more in 15 minutes than they had eaten in 3 days. Fear didn't vanish. It morphed into confusion, and confusion in its own way was even more frightening. Outside, a guard leaned against a post, tilting his hat back while watching the camp's perimeter. He looked nothing like the savage cowboy posters plastered across German bases. He looked calm, almost gentle. Ingrid watched him through the window as she chewed slowly. His posture reminded her of men she had seen in old paintings, farmers resting against fences, watching over fields. She didn't know that most American guards were farm boys, that they had grown up feeding neighbors during the Depression, that they had learned from childhood that hospitality wasn't weakness, it was character. That kindness wasn't offered because someone deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. She didn't know America adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention, believing it reflected national values. Nor did she know that the U.S. government had calculated that well-fed prisoners were less likely to rebel, less likely to escape, less likely to cause trouble. She only knew that nothing, absolutely nothing, matched the fear living inside her. The propaganda was cracking, not shattering yet, not collapsing, but cracking, hairline fractures running through the stories she had been raised on, stories about cruel Americans, stories about humiliation, stories about torture, stories designed to keep Germans fighting. A guard walked past the window then, glanced in, and nodded politely toward Ingrid. A polite nod from an enemy soldier. Her heart fluttered with an emotion she couldn't name yet. A fragile, flickering thing that felt like disbelief wrapped in hesitant relief. But fear still held the edges of her mind. Fear that this was temporary. Fear that the kindness would stop. Fear that punishment waited just beyond the next hour. Fear that everything here was too good, too clean, too warm to be real. Fear that mercy was just another weapon. She swallowed, tasting pepper and butter on her tongue. And for the first time since her capture, she wondered quietly to herself, what if the world she believed in was built on lies? It was a dangerous question, a forbidden question, a question she wasn't ready to answer. But it was the beginning of the unraveling, the beginning of doubt, the beginning of a truth that frightened her more than any propaganda. America, for all its power, did not act like an enemy, and that terrified her. For several seconds after they sat down, the German women didn't lift their forks. The biscuits steamed softly on their plates, the gravy settling into warm, white pools. The smell alone was overwhelming. Pepper, milk, sausage fat, a fullness none of them had felt in months. But their hands stayed motionless. Across the tables, the cooks and guards exchanged glances. They had seen this before. Fear had to be fed slowly. A Texan cook, broad-shouldered, red-haired, his apron stained with flour, stepped out from behind the serving counter carrying another tray piled high with fresh biscuits. The morning sunlight caught the steam rising from it, turning it into a soft haze around him. He approached the POW tables with deliberate gentleness. "All right, ladies," he said in a warm drawl. "Still plenty more." The women shrank back instinctively, shoulders tightening, eyes dropping to the floor. One of them covered her plate with her hands as though expecting it to be snatched away. Another whispered something terrified in German. The cook slowed. He glanced at the guards as if asking silently whether he'd done something wrong. Private Amos, a lanky guard from Oklahoma, shook his head. "Just give him a moment," he murmured. The cook nodded and crouched slightly so his face wasn't looming above them. He set the tray gently on the table and slid one biscuit toward a woman who looked moments away from fainting. She stared at it as though it were a live animal. Then, in a trembling voice, she lifted her eyes and asked the question none of them dared to say aloud. "Why? We're enemies." The words hung in the air, raw, exhausted, honest. The cook blinked, taken aback. Then he scratched the back of his neck and answered with a simplicity that wasn't rehearsed or strategic, but purely instinctive. "In Texas, we feed people. Doesn't matter who." The room shifted. Not physically, not loudly, but something in the atmosphere softened. The women looked at one another, unsure if they had heard correctly. The cook stood again, brushing his hands on his apron. "No one goes hungry in a U.S. camp," added Private Amos, stepping forward. "Not on my watch, and not on theirs." He pointed his thumb at the kitchen staff, who nodded firmly. The statement wasn't boastful. It wasn't political. It was simply fact. One by one, the women began to lift their forks. The first bites were cautious, a nibble, a small taste, barely more than a touch. But then came the second bite, the third, and suddenly their restraint crumbled. Biscuits disappeared. Gravy was scraped with the sides of forks. Breaths turned into quiet, shaky sighs. It was not elegance. It was survival. Ingrid took her first real bite slowly. The biscuit crumbled softly between her teeth. The gravy, thick and warm, coated her tongue with a richness she had forgotten food could have. She closed her eyes as her body recognized nourishment and rushed to seize it. Her shoulders trembled. She set her fork down for a moment to steady herself. Across from her, Gerda ate with the desperation of someone who thought the plate might vanish if she looked away. Another woman pressed her hand to her mouth as she chewed, as if ashamed of the noises her hunger was making. Watching them, the guards grew strangely quiet. They weren't hardened soldiers. Most were farm boys, students, small-town mechanics who had never imagined themselves wearing a uniform outside of Sunday parades. Seeing the enemy starve didn't fill them with triumph. It filled them with something else, something closer to sorrow, even responsibility. Private Amos leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, chewing thoughtfully on a toothpick. "My mama used to feed half the county during the Depression," he said to a fellow guard. "Folks came with nothing but dust on their clothes. She'd still give 'em a hot meal." The other guard nodded. "Seems right to do the same here." If the women had understood the numbers behind this meal, the shock might have been even greater. In 1944, America produced more than 96,000 aircraft in 1 year. It rolled out tanks, ships, and cargo trucks faster than the Axis could destroy them. 40% of America's beef went directly to the military. Texas alone raised more than 10 million cattle, more than some European nations had people. Food wasn't scarce in America. Food was strategic power. But to the women at the table, biscuits and gravy weren't a symbol of economics or industry. They were memory. They were comfort. They were the language of childhood kitchens they thought they would never smell again. A woman named Hilda began crying silently as she ate. Tears slid down her cheeks, falling into her gravy. The cook saw and stepped closer, unsure if something was wrong. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked gently. She didn't speak English, but she understood his tone. She nodded quickly, wiping her eyes. Then she gestured to the biscuit and placed a hand over her heart. The cook understood. "Eat as much as you need." She bowed her head in gratitude. There was a reason biscuits and gravy mattered in Texas. It was the food that had carried working families through the Great Depression, cheap, filling, made from flour, fat, milk, pepper, whatever was available. Comfort food wasn't a trend in America. It was a survival tradition. Farm boys ate biscuits before sunup. Rail workers ate them in tin lunch pails. Ranch hands ate them after long nights in freezing weather. It was the food of people who believed in sharing the little they had, because everyone knew what hunger felt like. In Texas, feeding someone was more than hospitality. It was a declaration. "You're safe here. You matter. You're under our roof now, even if only for a meal." And so, without planning it, without any grand moral statement, the cooks of Camp Hearn passed down one of the oldest traditions of American culture to the very people they were told to fear. Not politics, not ideology, just warmth. After the initial rush of hunger faded, the women began to look up from their plates. Their eyes scanned the room with a new kind of confusion, uncertain, cautious, but no longer terrified. A guard approached with a metal pitcher. "Anyone want more milk?" Milk. The word alone felt like a luxury. He poured carefully for whoever nodded, offering a small smile each time. No suspicion, no malice, just simple human decency. Ingrid watched him for a long moment before asking, in broken English, "You treat us like guests?" The guard paused, surprised by the question. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you're prisoners, sure, but you're people first. My folks raised me that way. People first." She repeated the phrase silently. "Menschen zuerst." It sounded heavier in German, and somehow more painful. When the meal finally ended, the women didn't rise immediately. They lingered over their empty plates, savoring the last warmth. The cooks began cleaning up, stacking trays, scraping pans, moving with the efficient rhythm of men who had fed thousands before. The red-haired Texan cook passed by Ingrid again. She gathered her courage. "You give good food," she said haltingly. "Why, for us." He paused, glanced at the others, then answered with a simple truth. "Because someone taught me that feeding folks is just the right thing to do. Doesn't need to be more complicated than that." She stared at him, trying to reconcile that idea with everything she had learned. Strength in her world had always been loud, violent, assertive, merciless, but here strength was quiet. Strength stood barefoot in a kitchen, stirring gravy. Strength opened its hand instead of closing its fist. Strength fed the enemy. And as she stood to return her tray, Ingrid whispered to herself a phrase that felt both terrifying and comforting. "This is not what we were told." She didn't know it yet, but this moment, the warmth of a biscuit, the softness of a cook's voice, was the beginning of her heart cracking open. Not in surrender, in awakening, because in Camp Hearn, kindness wasn't strategy. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't a tactic. It was culture. It was identity. It was America. And that was a power stronger than any weapon she had ever known. The breakdown did not happen all at once. It came like a slow, trembling ripple. One woman cracking, then another, until the entire room felt heavy with a grief no one had prepared for. It began with Marta Vogel. She was 30, one of the oldest among them, and had survived on little more than cabbage water and turnip scraps for months before her capture. Her cheeks were drawn so tight the bones seemed ready to pierce through. Her hands never stopped shaking, not from fear, but from malnutrition. She took a cautious bite of her biscuit, just a corner. Then she froze. Her jaw trembled, her throat tightened, her eyes widened as if the taste alone had struck her physically. It wasn't just food, it was memory. Butter, flour, warmth. Her mother's kitchen in Dresden, where biscuits were a once-a-year luxury, eaten quietly as if speaking might make them disappear. And then, without warning, Marta broke. A sound escaped her, half sob, half gasp. Her fork clattered onto the table. She pressed both hands to her mouth, but the tears slipped through her fingers anyway. Her shoulders shook so violently that Ingrid reached out instinctively, but Marta was already folding in on herself. "Mama," she whispered. Then again, louder, broken. "Mama!" The cook nearest them stopped wiping the counter. The guard straightened. One of them, Private Amos, took a step forward before stopping himself, unsure how close he should get, but the collapse had already begun. Across the table, Elise Hartman stared at Marta with glassy, frightened eyes. She was only 19, barely an adult, captured in France while manning a radio relay, post. Her hunger had aged her. Her cheeks were pale, lips nearly colorless. Her hair, once thick, hung in brittle strands around her face. As Marta sobbed, Elise swallowed hard and took a bite of her own biscuit. It was too much, too soft, too rich, too warm, too kind. Her breath hitched. A tremor ran through her chest. She dropped her biscuit and pressed her fist against her sternum, trying to contain whatever was rising inside her. "It's a trap," she whispered to herself in German. "Food like this means they want something. It must be a trick. They will take it away." But even as she said it, the lie collapsed inside her. Nothing in the American's behavior matched cruelty. Nothing matched the warnings she had been fed. Her shoulders fell, her face crumpled, and she began to cry. Not quietly, not politely, but in messy, racking sobs that shook her from head to toe. A guard approached slowly, palms open, not touching, not intruding. "Ma'am, you all right?" he asked softly. Elise didn't understand the words, but she felt the gentleness, and that gentleness undid her completely. On the far end of the table, another woman, Lotta, tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. Months of starvation had stripped her muscles to nothing. She sank to her knees, gripping the edge of the table to keep from collapsing entirely. Ingrid rushed to her side, but a guard reached her first. He didn't shout. He didn't grab her roughly. He knelt beside her, offering an arm. "Easy there," he murmured. "Take your time. You're okay." He helped her back into her seat, moving with the careful tenderness of someone trying not to startle a wounded animal. Then he stepped away and returned a moment later with a cup of milk. "Drink slow," he instructed. Lotta did, and as she did, tears streamed silently down her face, dripping onto the worn wooden table. The cooks, who had seen prisoners cry before, exchanged glances. But this was different. This wasn't fear. This wasn't shock alone. This was grief. Grief born of kindness they had never expected, never asked for, and did not know how to accept. A grief so deep it became a kind of collapse. All around the room, German POW women were breaking open. One stared at her food, whispering Berlin street names as if calling out to a lost childhood. Another stuck her face in her hands as the scent of sausage gravy sent her into a spiral of homesickness. A third rocked slightly back and forth, murmuring prayers she had forgotten how to say. A fourth kept saying, "It shouldn't taste this good. It shouldn't." It was the taste of safety that destroyed them, the taste of a life that felt impossibly distant. It was unbearable because it felt like betrayal. Betrayal of the suffering they had left behind, betrayal of families still starving in Germany, betrayal of the belief that the enemy must be cruel. How do you accept kindness from someone you've been ordered to hate? How do you swallow food that is richer than anything your loved ones can find at home? For many of them, the answer was simple. You don't. You break. Private Amos knew what he was seeing. He had served guard duty long enough to understand that food triggered more than hunger in prisoners. He raised a hand to the cooks. "Bring more milk and bread and some blankets if you got 'em." Within minutes, the kitchen staff began placing pitchers of milk onto tables, refilling glasses with gentle nods. Another guard brought a stack of folded wool blankets, offering them quietly to women who shook uncontrollably from exhaustion. At no point did anyone bark an order. No one told them to sit straighter. No one told them to stop crying. They simply cared. Simple, decent, American care. The kind that didn't ask for thanks. The kind passed down from parents who had fed strangers during the Dust Bowl. The kind that didn't disappear even when the strangers wore the uniform of the enemy. While the women wept, history loomed behind their tears. Germany in 1944 was nearing collapse. Allied bombings had destroyed railway lines, food depots, and factories. Blockades choked supply routes. The turnip winter of 1917 had returned, haunting a new generation. Women fainted in ration lines. Children scavenged in bombed-out markets. Entire towns survived on watery vegetable broth. A study from late 1944 showed that 70% of German women were suffering from severe vitamin deficiencies, teeth loosening, hair falling out, eyesight dimming. And here, in Texas, the enemy placed warm food in their hands without hesitation. Why? How? The contrast was too sharp, too brutal. It cracked them wide open. Ingrid tried to hold herself together. She pressed her palms against the table, breathing slow, steady. But her composure didn't last. When she lifted her biscuit again and took another bite, the softness, the warmth, the richness hit her with the force of memory. Her mother's voice. Her father leaning over the table. The sound of church bells on Sunday mornings. The smell of butter when it was still affordable. The feeling of being safe. Gone now, burned away by war. Ingrid swallowed hard, but the grief rose anyway, choking her. She tried to blink away the tears, but they spilled over. She covered her mouth with her hand, letting out a small, shuddering gasp. A cook noticed. He didn't speak. He simply placed a napkin beside her plate and stepped away. That tiny gesture, soft as a feather, broke the last of her strength. She lowered her head and cried. Quietly at first, then with a shaking she couldn't control. She wasn't crying because of fear anymore. She wasn't crying because of hunger. She was crying because kindness felt like pain, because mercy hurt when you believed you did not deserve it, because the enemy was treating her better than her own country had in years. And yet, within the collapse, something else stirred, something small, hesitant, trembling like a newborn bird. A question. A dangerous question. If the Americans were capable of this kind of mercy, what else had been a lie? In the corner of the room, Private Amos watched the women quietly. He removed his hat, holding it respectfully against his chest, not because he had been told to, but because witnessing so much raw emotion felt like stepping into a sacred space. He whispered to the cook beside him. My grandparents fed strangers during the Depression. Folks lined up at their door with nothing but hope. And my grandparents still found a way to give them something warm to eat. Guess we're doing the same thing now. The cook nodded, eyes soft. That's who we are. Outside the mess hall, the Texas wind blew across the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of earth, cattle, and summer heat. Inside, 43 German women cried into biscuits and gravy. Not because the food was too rich, not because the kindness was too much, but because, in that moment, they realized a truth so profound it left them shaking. America had defeated their bodies in war, but their hearts were surrendering to something far more powerful. Mercy. For the rest of that morning, the German women moved through Camp Hearn as if walking on unfamiliar soil, because they were, a soil where fear no longer matched reality. A soil where kindness appeared in the smallest, quietest places. A soil where the enemy looked nothing like the monster they had been taught to imagine. Something had shifted inside them after the breakdown. Not completely, not instantly, but enough. Enough for their eyes to open a little wider, enough for their hearts to loosen, even if only by a thread. They began to see America clearly, not as a rumor, not as propaganda, but as it was. And that was the most frightening revelation of all. The first moment came barely an hour after breakfast, when the women were escorted outside to the medical station. They shuffled in a loose line, still weak from emotion and malnutrition. The guards walked a few paces behind, not pushing, not threatening, just there. One guard, a young private named Lawson from Nebraska, noticed a girl in the back wiping her eyes with the rough sleeve of her uniform. She was perhaps 18, maybe 19, but hunger had carved years into her face. He slowed his pace, stepping beside her. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean, folded handkerchief. White cotton, neatly pressed. He hesitated for a moment, almost shyly. Then he held it out. "For you," he said gently. The girl blinked. Her first instinct was suspicion. But when Lawson placed the handkerchief lightly in her palm, his touch careful, she froze. Not from fear this time, but astonishment. A guard. Giving her something soft? She pressed the cloth to her face and whispered in German, "Danke." Lawson didn't understand the word, but he understood the tone. "You're welcome, ma'am." The other women watched this small exchange, and something inside them stirred, something delicate, something dangerous. If cruelty is what keeps hatred alive, then kindness is what kills it. At the medical station, a nurse from Chicago examined each woman with brisk but tender professionalism. She checked bruises, cleaned cuts, examined swollen ankles, and asked questions through an interpreter. "Headaches? Dizziness? When did you last eat well? How long have you had this cough?" Her touch was gentle, experienced. Her voice was soft, and her eyes carried the calm certainty of someone who had seen suffering but refused to turn away from it. When she reached Marta, the nurse paused. Marta's cheeks were still streaked from her earlier sobbing. "You're dehydrated," the nurse said, "and underfed." Underfed. The understatement of the century. But the nurse didn't scold, didn't sigh, didn't speak with the cold authority German doctors often used on enlisted women. She simply handed Marta a cup of water. "Drink, slowly." Marta obeyed, and as the water touched her tongue, something inside her cracked again, not from pain this time, but from gentleness. "Why, help," Marta whispered in broken English. The nurse paused in surprise, then answered with the same sincerity as the cook earlier, "Because it's the right thing to do." All around, the women watched the Americans with cautious curiosity. They expected arrogance. They found modesty. They expected cruelty. They found patience. They expected humiliation. They found dignity. For the first time since arriving in Texas, the women allowed themselves to look at the guards, not with terror, but with the tentative curiosity of people reassessing their assumptions. These were not the caricatures painted by Nazi propaganda. These were young men who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who had grown up in a nation that didn't fear scarcity. Men who didn't shout because they didn't need to. Men who didn't insult because it offered no advantage. Men who behaved as though mercy was ordinary, routine, expected, unremarkable. That, more than anything, stunned the women. In Germany, kindness had become a rare and fragile commodity, hoarded like sugar or soap. Decency was something spoken of nostalgically, as if it belonged to another era. But in America, decency seemed woven into daily life, even here, in a prison camp. Ingrid felt the change most profoundly. Fear still lingered, yes, but it no longer controlled her thoughts. She began to see patterns she had never noticed before, patterns hidden beneath the surface of American life, an orderly efficiency to how the guards conducted roll call, a respectful tone in how they addressed prisoners, a disciplined routine that did not depend on intimidation, but on a shared understanding of fairness. She realized something painful. America was strong because it chose to be decent, strong because it believed in rules, in conventions, in the Geneva Principles, strong because it didn't need cruelty to assert power. And Germany. Germany had grown strong by fear, by threat, by force. Fear corrodes discipline. Cruelty erodes trust. Propaganda blinds a nation to its own weakness. But America had built something different. A nation where even prisoners felt the weight of its moral confidence. Later, during a short break in the yard, the women sat under a strip of shade beside a water barrel. The Texas sun pressed down, relentless but somehow comforting in its predictability. A cook walked by carrying an extra pot of gravy he hadn't used. He stopped beside the group. "You ladies want more?" he asked. The women stiffened, confused. Surely he didn't mean it literally. They exchanged quick glances. Elise opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated, cheeks flushing with shame. They weren't supposed to ask for more. Not in Germany. Not anywhere. The cook saw their insecurity and smiled kindly. "Here," he said softly. He knelt and ladled a small portion of warm gravy into a metal tin one of the women held. He did it gently, with the care of someone feeding his own family. "You don't gotta be shy about food," he added, rising to his feet again. "Not here." When he walked away, silence enveloped the group. Then one woman whispered, "They feed us, without expecting anything." Another murmured, "They do not look down on us." A third said, voice shaking, "They treat us better than the Reich ever treated its own people." Ingrid drew her knees to her chest and rested her head on them. "We were wrong," she whispered, then louder, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and relief. "We were wrong about everything." As the day unfolded, more small acts of kindness rippled through the camp. A guard returned a dropped scarf without pocketing it. A cook refilled a cup without being asked. A nurse checked a woman's fever twice just to be sure. Another guard stood between a frightened POW and a barking stray dog that wandered near the fence. None of these gestures were dramatic, but they were devastating in their ordinariness. Kindness was not extraordinary here. Kindness was the standard. And that truth unraveled the final threads of propaganda still clinging to the women's hearts. They began to compare, not out of bitterness but out of awakening. Germany was fear, America was safety. Germany was scarcity, America was abundance. Germany was obedience, America was dignity. Germany was desperation, America was mercy. That night, as the women settled into their bunks, Ingrid lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the cicadas singing outside. The Texas night felt impossibly vast, stretching across the plains like an invitation to breathe again. She whispered into the darkness, unsure if anyone else was still awake. "This country is not what they told us." No one answered, but she felt agreement hanging in the air like a shared heartbeat. For the first time since her capture, she felt something she had tried to bury. Not hope, not yet, but clarity. A clarity born from mercy. A clarity that shook her deeper than fear ever had. America had shown its power, not through weapons, not through force, but through kindness. And it was that kindness more than anything else that began to change them. The next weeks at Camp Hearn unfolded slowly, softly, like a long exhale after years of suffocating fear. The initial shock had settled. The breakdown had passed. What remained was something quieter but far deeper. Reflection. Reassessment. Rewriting the world as they thought they understood it. The German women began to observe the camp with new eyes, not as prisoners searching for danger, but as human beings trying to understand a country that defied everything they had been taught. One of the first places this shift appeared was in their journals. At night, when the lights dimmed and the cicadas began their endless Texas chorus, the barracks filled with the faint scratch of pencils moving across paper. Journals were permitted. The Americans even provided extra writing pads when the women ran out. Ingrid wrote first hesitantly, "Americans feed us more than our own country ever did." She stared at the sentence for a long time, tracing the words with her finger. It felt dangerous to admit, even privately. But it was true. Marta wrote, "They treated us as humans before we treated them as humans." Her hands shook as she wrote it. The idea hurt. It also healed. Elise, the youngest, wrote in a small, tight handwriting, This country is strong because it is kind. None of them would have dared to write such things weeks earlier. But now the words came easily, because truth, once seen, refuses to remain silent. During the days, kindness continued in small, almost invisible acts that gradually reshaped their understanding of America. One morning, in the kitchen, the red-haired cook who had served them biscuits and gravy noticed Elise hovering shyly near the stove. She lingered there every day pretending to help clean, but really watching the gravy being made as if trying to memorize each movement. "You want to learn?" the cook asked gently. Elise's eyes widened. She pointed to herself in disbelief. "Me?" He smiled. "Sure. Come here." She stepped closer, and for the next 15 minutes he taught her what his mother had taught him: how to melt butter without burning it, how to sprinkle flour evenly, how to whisk patiently until the mixture thickened just right, how to add pepper not by recipe but by instinct. Elise listened earnestly, nodding, repeating the English words under her breath. Whisk. Pepper. Simmer. When the gravy finished, thick and steaming, he handed her a spoon. "Go on, taste it." She did, and her entire face softened. The other kitchen hands watched and smiled. A German POW learning an American comfort dish. A moment no propaganda could have imagined. Elsewhere, a different lesson unfolded. A group of women gathered near the laundry line where a guard named Wilson, broad-shouldered, Alabama-born, was repairing a broken hinge. He overheard the women practicing English with each other, murmuring basic phrases they had picked up from the medical staff. "Good morning. Sorry. Please." Wilson cleared his throat. "You ladies know how to say thank you?" They looked at him blankly, as if the concept itself felt foreign. He chuckled, not mocking, but warm. "It's easy. Just say thank, then you. Simple." The women exchanged glances, then tried it tentatively. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." "Close enough," Wilson said, grinning. The women giggled among themselves, small, shy laughter that felt like sunlight after a long storm. By the end of the week, every German woman in camp knew how to say thank you in English, and they used it often. "Thank you for the blanket. Thank you for the extra biscuit. Thank you for carrying the water bucket. Thank you for helping me stand." Two nations, once enemies, sharing the simplest human word. The moments of reflection deepened when the guards began sharing stories of their own hardships. One afternoon, while the women worked in the garden, Private Lawson walked past carrying a bucket of feed. The women paused, watching him quietly. The rhythm of the day had become familiar. American footsteps no longer made them flinch. Lawson stopped near Ingrid, wiping sweat from his brow. "You know," he said, "my mama used to feed whole families during the Depression. Folks lined up by the road with nothing but hunger. She never turned 'em away. Not once." Ingrid listened silently. Lawson wasn't bragging. He spoke with the calm conviction of someone who believed deeply in what he said. "Hard times make people mean, or they make people kind," he continued. "Mama said, kindness keeps a nation together when everything else falls apart." He didn't stay long, but his words lingered. Ingrid realized something she had never considered. America's generosity wasn't an accident. It was tradition. It was culture. It was learned at kitchen tables and church basements long before it reached a POW camp. Beyond the fences, history was shifting. News drifted through the camp. The Allies were advancing in France. Factories across America were running day and night. Victory seemed inevitable. The guards didn't boast. They didn't gloat. They simply worked, clean, efficient, focused. Their confidence wasn't rooted in arrogance, but in a certainty built from unity. America was preparing for the war's end, preparing to rebuild Europe, preparing to step into an era historians would later call the good times. The women sensed this. They felt the momentum of a nation that seemed determined not only to win the war, but to heal afterward. It was a stark contrast to Germany, a place collapsing from the inside out. In the barracks, Marta whispered one night, "In Germany, we feared the future." She touched her blanket, soft and warm. "In America, I think they trust the future." The others nodded in the dark, though no one spoke. The comparison was unavoidable. Germany, fear, scarcity, suspicion, America, abundance, stability, generosity. The more they saw, the more clearly the truth emerged. The propaganda had been wrong not just in detail, but in spirit, in essence, in everything. Reflection came even in small silences. As the women walked to the morning roll call one day, a breeze carried the scent of baking bread from the mess hall. Elise slowed her steps, breathing deeply. "In Germany," she said softly to Ingrid, "we lined up for food in fear. Here, we line up and smell bread." Ingrid nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. They passed a guard standing by the gate. He tipped his hat politely as they walked by. Not a guard, not a jailer, just a man doing his duty with dignity. This was the America they would remember. Not its factories, not its weapons, not its victories, but its decency. On a quiet evening, as the sun sank behind the Texas hills, painting the sky in gold and rose, the women sat outside the barracks in a loose circle. They didn't talk much. They simply watched the horizon. Hilda broke the silence first. "I never imagined feeling safe in a prison camp." Gerda nodded. "They broke our bodies in Europe. Here, they are healing us." Elise added, "This country, it grows strong by feeding people, not starving them." Finally, Ingrid whispered, "We came here expecting death, and instead we found America." Not the America of propaganda, not the America of fear, but an America that lived its values without needing recognition. An America that won hearts the same way it won wars. Through discipline, through abundance, through mercy, through moral clarity. In their journals that night, the women wrote new lines. "I did not expect kindness from an enemy, but perhaps kindness is why they are winning. If this is America, then we knew nothing. They feed us, they teach us, they help us stand. This is a strong country because it chooses to be good." Outside, the wind carried the scent of hay and summer grass. Inside, reflection softened hardened souls. For the first time, they were not simply surviving captivity. They were learning from it, growing from it, changing because of it. And in the quiet of that Texas night, every woman felt the same realization settling deep in her chest. America had broken their fear and replaced it with understanding. The war ended the way thunder does, loud at first, then fading slowly into the horizon, leaving behind a strange quiet the world didn't know how to fill. In the summer of 1945, Camp Hearn began to empty. Men were processed and sent east. Women were gathered into groups, issued travel papers, given one last medical check, and told they would be going home. Home. The word did not land the way it once might have, because for many of the German women, home no longer meant safety or familiarity or promise. It meant ruins, hunger, roofless apartments, streets where the echoes of war still clung like smoke, and, to their own surprise, leaving America hurt more than they dared admit. On a soft morning in September 1945, the women lined up in the yard for the final roll call. The Texas sun was lower now, less punishing, casting warm gold across the barracks. They stood straighter than when they first arrived. Their cheeks had filled out. Their eyes were brighter, their bodies steadier. Ingrid clutched a small cloth bundle against her chest. Inside it was everything the camp allowed her to take. A white cotton handkerchief Private Lawson had given her, a small notebook filled with her journal entries about biscuits, gravy, and mercy. A few New English words written phonetically: thank you, safe, warm, friend, and a folded recipe card the cook had secretly slipped her on her last day in the kitchen. Biscuits and gravy, Texas style. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had arrived with. It was, in its own way, a map of her transformation. The guards gathered as the trucks pulled forward. They didn't cheer. They didn't mock. They simply stood in a loose line, hats in hand, the same respectful quiet they offered at Sunday services. Private Lawson stepped toward Ingrid. "You take care now, ma'am." She nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you. For everything." She said it in English, clear, soft, true. Behind her, Marta embraced one of the nurses who had tended her during her first weeks in camp. Elise handed a small carved wooden trinket to the cook, something she had whittled secretly from scrap wood. He accepted it with an embarrassed kind of pride. "Didn't have to do that," he murmured, but the look on his face said he was grateful she had. One guard, Wilson, crouched to give a young POW a final handshake. Careful, gentle, as though she were his own younger sister. These weren't the farewells of enemies. They were the farewells of people whose lives had intersected in a way none of them could have predicted. When the trucks finally began rolling toward the train depot, the guards raised their hands in a simple, solemn gesture. Not victory, not triumph, just respect. Ingrid turned once, just once, to see their faces as the camp receded behind her. She carried that image with her for the rest of her life. Germany greeted them with silence. The train rumbled through landscapes that bore no resemblance to the country they had left. Factories were twisted carcasses of steel and smoke. Cities were skeletons. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Children with hollow eyes gathered near the tracks, waving weakly at passing cars in hopes of finding food. Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, all different, all broken. Ingrid stepped off the train and felt the air catch in her throat. She had expected hardship, but she had not expected devastation so complete. Her childhood street was unrecognizable. Her mother's apartment no longer existed. Neighbors shuffled through ruins, carrying buckets like ghosts searching for lost parts of themselves. And amid this landscape, Ingrid opened her small cloth bundle and held the handkerchief to her heart. A simple piece of white cotton, clean, soft, intact. No German handkerchief had survived like this. But an American one had. That winter, she lived in a crowded aid shelter where blankets were shared and food was rationed tightly. Every evening she wrote in her journal, adding lines she could not have imagined writing a year earlier. America fed us when we had nothing. They were our enemies, but they treated us better than our own government treated us. We survived because the Americans showed mercy. She taught other women in the shelter the English words she had learned. Warm, safe, friend, thank you. And one day, while stirring a pot of thin barley soup over a shared stove, she decided to try making biscuits and gravy from memory. It was not perfect. The flour was rough. The milk was watered down. The butter non-existent. But the smell, soft, familiar, comforting, drew people into the kitchen like moths to light. Mothers, children, old men, all gathering around her pot, breathing in warmth they hadn't felt in months. For a fragile moment, the shelter did not feel like a place of despair. It felt like Texas. It felt like mercy. Word spread. "Make it again," they begged. "Show us. Teach us." And she did, because what she had brought home from America was not a recipe. It was dignity. Years passed. Germany rebuilt. Children grew. Cities rose slowly from rubble. And the women who had been POWs grew old enough to tell stories. Not war stories, not battles, not losses, not ideology, but stories of Texas mornings, of kindness unexpected, of biscuits and gravy served across the lines of enemy and ally. Around kitchen tables, in small apartments warmed by the steady hum of post-war radiators, they told their grandchildren, "America fed us when we had nothing. They treated us like people when the world treated us like burdens. They were our enemies, and yet they cared for us better than our own leaders ever did." Some grandchildren rolled their eyes at first. Tales of kindness in war sounded unbelievable. So the women opened their old journals, yellowed pages covered in careful handwriting. The words spoke for themselves. And some nights when the grandchildren pressed further, the women would whisper something softer, something nearly sacred. "We were saved, not by weapons, not by politics, but by mercy." Decades later, the descendants of these women, scattered across Europe, America, Canada, Australia, would stumble upon videos and stories online. The comment sections filled with echoes. "My grandmother was a POW in Texas. She always said the Americans saved her life." "My grandfather remembered the food. He said he ate better in the U.S. camp than at home. Our family owes America everything." And from Americans, "My granddad worked at a POW camp. He always said they deserved respect. This is the America I was raised to believe in. We were strongest when we were kind." It became a digital reunion across generations, a meeting of grandchildren who had inherited two sides of the same mercy. Ingrid lived to be 89. On her final Christmas, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she asked for one last dish. "Biscuits," she said softly, "and gravy." Her family laughed affectionately. "You and your American food," they teased. But as they cooked, she held the old handkerchief on her lap, rubbing the worn cotton between her fingers. The same handkerchief that had been given to her on her first day in Texas. The same one she had carried across the ocean, across the ruins of Germany, across decades of rebuilding. When the biscuits were ready, she took a bite and closed her eyes. She whispered, almost too softly to hear, "They defeated us on the battlefield, but saved us in the dining hall." Her family grew quiet. Some understood, some did not. But the truth lingered in the room like the scent of warm bread. Mercy had outlived the war. Kindness had outlasted the hatred, and America, at its best, had written itself into the hearts of those who once feared it. That was the legacy. Not victory, not conquest, not dominance. Humanity. A humanity strong enough to feed the enemy. Strong enough to heal what war had broken. Strong enough to be remembered 70 years later in a language not native to the women who carried it home. And it began with a plate of biscuits and gravy.